pleasure to see you. I'll tell you, don't get any better.
As you know, General Joulwan's in town for the semi-annual SINCS conference, and we twisted his arm to come down here and talk to you again about Bosnia. There's no better person to do it. General Joulwan.
Thank you very much, Ken. It's always a pleasure to see all of you again. My purpose this morning, let me get right into it, is to give you an update on sort of where we are and where we're going. I know the last time we were here, we went into some detail on as we approached 120, and I thought what I'd do is try to bring you up to date with using a few slides and then take some questions you might have. I want to make it clear, a key point is some very significant work that's been done, and I want to try to show you that because the troops have been doing superbly, not just in terms of separating the force and transfer of land and also getting weapons and forces back to cantonment areas, but there's been a lot of work done on roads, on bridges, to try to really open this country up to civilian agencies and to civilians. And I want to discuss that. But first of all, let me go to the next chart. I think it's very important to say we're at D+135, and one of the other points that I want to make before we jump ahead to what's going to happen after D+365, I think it's very important to keep our focus where it's meant to be, and that is on the mission. And so at D+135, the op plan, the operations plan that we developed that's been approved by the North Atlantic Council, still in effect, is on track on the military tasks that we've been given. Next slide. Let me explain it this way. That when you look at the series of tasks that we've been given over the last 4+ months, I think it's very significant that what we have done here is to lay the foundation for success. And those military tasks, when we deployed the force during the toughest winter they've had in many years, in the most difficult terrain in Europe, it was done extremely well. So we deployed the force and separated the force by 4 kilometers, the former warring factions by D+30, transferred land at D+45. The gaining entity came into that territory at D+90, separated the force out to 10 kilometers, and started to turn in air defense weapons. Now, D+120, building on all of this, forces are now moving back to cantonment areas with troops and with heavy weapons. That is going to take a little bit more time, but the majority of the movement has taken place, and it's going to take probably about another 30 days before we have all the weapons and the forces back in the cantonment areas. So separating the force, transfer of land, troops back into barracks, heavy weapons in storage areas, that opens up the country for the civilian agencies to begin to do their work, and also for population centers where elections are going to be held, also for freedom of movement for the civilians. So there's where we are. The issue is, where do we go now? And I am trying, in the best military advice that I've given, next chart please, is to really look at the time between D+120 and D+270, which is September, and have our focus of attention now as we do what I call phase 4 of the op plan, transition to peace. And so that what we want to do during this time is to have all the former warring factions in their cantonment areas, the inter-entity boundary line agreed upon, and that inter-entity boundary line does not become an international boundary or border. Dayton really talked about 2 entities of 1 country. The Republic of Srpska and the Federation are 2 entities of Bosnia-Herzegovina. And so we don't want that to become an international boundary. We are removing checkpoints, bunkers, OPs, that we hope to have freedom of movement as well as airports open, all the prisoners relieved, refugees can return during this time. The International Tribunal hopefully will complete much of its inquiry. The International Peace Task Force up to full strength, arms control agreed upon, reconstruction up and running, the election campaign developed and operational, the Federation established and functional, and we do our troop-to-task analysis, and I'll talk some about that if you have questions, and try to say, how do we now look at the new tasks that we have in this particular part of the operations plan. Now, much of this is political and civilian tasks, but I think the underpinning of that is freedom of movement. And let me show you what I mean. Next slide, please. Now, this is where we are at D+120. I think it's significant here because there's not been adequate focus on what has been accomplished by the military side while we were doing all those other tasks. The key, I think, for success is to have access throughout the country, total freedom of movement. Notice the confrontation line here is not an international boundary, one country. And I think it's very interesting what has been accomplished. We now have linked Bosnia-Herzegovina to Europe. We have now 2 fixed bridges and pontoon bridges across the Sava River. That needs to be opened up now for not only IFOR and the civilian agencies, but for civilian traffic as well. All these here are bridges that have been repaired or built. And that number is at 51 bridges have either been repaired or rebuilt in this first 120 days. That to me is a significant accomplishment. All the roads, the main roads, are now open. 50% of the rail line, and I'll show you that in a minute, 50% of the rail line is open. Indeed, General Nash has now started to move fuel by rail. And we hope to get the airports open, particularly Sarajevo, by D+180, which will be sometime in June. You should also know that NATO has authorized to date $74 million for roads, bridges, and engineer projects. Lieutenant General Walker, the ARC commander, has identified another over 300 projects that tie into this freedom of movement. And so it's very significant, and I think it's important that we can now, over 90% of the population, where you see these little yellow dots, can be reached now by secure roads. We still have some mining problems here, but for the most part, the major roads are open. That's going to be very important in this phase when we start talking about elections. Next slide. And that, by the way, is part of the mission. I show you this because this is photographs taken of bridges. Here you can see, I believe by Doughboy, the bridge that's down. Here you see it being rebuilt. Here there are some other examples of bridges that have been built by the military as they're trying to open up the country for freedom of movement. I think it's very important that we've done about over 50 of these, armored launch bridges as well as Bailey bridges and fixed bridges. But a significant expenditure of time, energy, money by the troops in getting this done. Next slide. When we talk about support to the International Tribunal, again, this has been significant, and there's very good coordination. When I talk about the guidance in terms of within our capabilities, IFOR must do all those tasks. They don't go away. Separation of forces, monitoring of the cantonment areas, freedom of movement throughout the whole country. In addition to that, within our capabilities, we're supporting the International Tribunal. Area security is very important. We provide that area security that they then go out and do their investigation. And we provide life support as well as liaison and a great deal of reconnaissance and surveillance of those sites. In the Srebrenica area, everywhere you see a star is where we have assisted the International Tribunal in their efforts. Also in the Prizador area and Brichko area. But these are the suspected and known mass grave sites. They have given us a priority of about 15 that we're working with, and they now have, as I said, a liaison officer with the ACE Rapid Reaction Corps. But constant communications and coordination is ongoing, and it's working out extremely well. Next slide, please. Now, one of the things that I wanted to make clear, because there's been some speculation on the guidance that I have received from the NAC on what I call mission completion guidance. I I think it's very important that the mission given to me by the 16 nations was for 1 year. And so that is through December 20th. I have said that we need to then maintain some capability, and it's too early for me to say what that capability should be, but sufficient capability to do our mission through that time. And so a mission-capable IFOR will remain until that time. Also, the instructions, no substantial decrease in the IFOR force until D+270 or after the elections. And we hope that the elections will be held within that time frame by September D+270, and that we can then, depending on all those conditions I talked about, will determine when we will begin the redeployment of the IFOR force. But it may begin, I say may, between 2+70 and 365. And then the redeployment may take some weeks after D+365. The NATO force may take some time after that until we get all the forces out. But the key is to keep a force in there to make sure that we can do our mission straight up to that 1 year. And then this is what I talked about earlier. We do what we call troop-to-task analysis. The first part, the first 120 days, to set the force, separate the former warring factions, expand that to 10 kilometers, transfer of land, cantonment areas. We now will look at the different tasks that we're going to have in the D+120 to D+270, particularly focusing on freedom of movement for the elections. And what does that mean? And so there may be some force mix adjustments as particularly the NATO and non-NATO nations, other than primarily the U.S., rotate forces in. And the commanders are now looking at what that force mix should be. Do we want more engineers, more military units to come in and assist in these new tasks? And that's what, this has not yet come in from the field, but there'll be no increase in the IFOR limit that we've talked about. It will be a change of mix depending on the mission. I believe that's my last slide. I might add that we also are providing substantial support to the International Police Task Force, and I'm happy to report that about 1,300 of the 1,721 police force, the International Police Force, is now present, and I hope by the June-July time frame that the total number will be provided by the nations that have pledged them. So I hope this has been useful. This is sort of an update of where we are, and I'll be glad to take any questions you might have. Yes?
How would you characterize the freedom of movement now? And are you satisfied with it, or dissatisfied, or disappointed, or?
I would say that given where we are right now, I think we've made substantial progress. What we have to do is to take the two entities and try to have some reconciliation between the two. I think that's going to be a challenge, but clearly Dayton says that you have one country, and the challenge is going to be along that inter-entity boundary for freedom of movement to take place. I might add that I think we've seen in the recent past where there have been large demonstrations coming down there at the inter-entity boundary line, we've had some difficulties. IFOR is trying to prevent violence. And where they've come in small groups, there's been relatively little problem of getting one ethnic group to be able to cross over. We're trying to work with the UNHCR right now, trying to coordinate that with the High Representative, the International Police Task Force, and the factions police forces are also involved. There's a lot of discussion going on now to how to control it. I think it's going to be very important that we keep insisting that freedom of movement take place. But what we don't want is to have these violent clashes that large-scale demonstrations can bring about. Yes?
Could you tell us what the progress is and what the problems are with the creation and consolidation of the Federation Army, given that arming and training is posited upon training the Federation Army, not the Muslims individually?
Well, there's a great attempt being made in trying to bring about all different factors in the Federation to include the military. it's too early to tell, but we are making some progress. And in fact, there's been a proposal to try to take one of the barracks that is in a questionable area on both sides and make that a Federation barracks, that perhaps they can have some sort of a Ministry of Defense or some joint facility where both can use it. We have much more work to do in that area. Again, it's much more political than it is military, but we're making slow progress in that area.
Just to follow, could you give us any assessment of how long you think it's likely to be before you can certify it's a going military concern that can be armed and trained?
I'd rather not give you a time on that right now. It is a challenge. The High Representative in particular is working that, and is working that with the IFOR commander as well. Yes.
General, how many Iranians or other foreign forces remain in Bosnia?
Again, I can't give you a firm number. I would tell you that over 1,000 have left. We're still concerned about what may be there. We think it's less than it's been in the past, but the number there still concerns us, and we would like all of the foreign forces to be removed.
Approximate?
I'd rather not give you an approximate number, but it's less than what it's been in the past.
Just on the same point, that when it comes to determining, when it comes time to provide equipment, particularly heavy weapons and the training, that the United States will be relying on your judgment that there's been substantial or satisfactory compliance with this provision that all the foreign fighters be removed from the country. Are you going to require that the very last Iranian or person from another country that the very last one be out before you certify that, or is there some leeway there?
Well, I think the key is going to be what poses a threat to the IFOR forces. We would like to make sure that all foreign forces are removed in compliance with Dayton, and it would not just be my recommendation. It truly is also a political issue as well. I have made it very clear that I think it's very important that we comply with Dayton, which is that all foreign forces be removed. Yes.
But just to be clear, so you're saying that it wouldn't necessarily have to be down to the last, certified that the last person has left. It's more, I think you said, what poses a threat to the forces.
Again, though, but let me be clear, all foreign forces should be removed from Bosnia-Herzegovina. I'm very much concerned that even small numbers can pose a threat. But I think it's very important we keep the pressure on that all foreign forces be removed. Yes?
Kind of a technical question. The Bosnia operation has afforded some opportunity to test some new warfighting technologies and equipment, in particular as far as communications go, and I thought maybe you could just give me your assessment how things like the Joint Broadcast System have enhanced the operation.
Well, communications have played a key role in that. I'm not sure whether I can get into what new techniques we're using. We're using a lot of old techniques, too, of making sure that we have proper communications for a multinational force. We've learned a lot of lessons, and that communications is very important, and liaison is very important. But I'd rather not speculate on any new techniques.
Yesterday, Hans Vandenbroek from the European Union said that if Mladic and Karadzic were still running around in Bosnia by the time an election is held, that election would be a sham. Do you have progress report on where you think that issue stands, and do you agree with that assessment?
Well, first of all, those two individuals, that truly is an issue for the signatories to the Dayton Agreement to address. It is a political issue primarily, and I think those that have signed the Dayton Agreement need to make sure that indicted war criminals are brought to justice. That to me is not a function of, it's not a mission that IFOR has been given. If we come in contact in the normal conduct of our military task, we will detain them and turn them over to proper authorities. I think what the best thing we can do is focus on what I've said here, in creating those conditions between now and plus 270 days, the elections. And the elections, to me, are very important for the people of Bosnia-Herzegovina. And I think it would also get at those two individuals that you're talking about, that if a government can be elected by the people in a democratic fashion, then I think that would go a long way to creating stability within the country. But we and the IFOR are not going to get involved in at this point, chasing after those two individuals. Yes?
Is it your assessment that Bosnia, as a federation of Bosnia-Herzegovina, as a country, is a viable entity once IFOR leaves?
I think it's premature to say that. I hope so. That's our whole goal, is to try to ensure that the Federation survives. I think there have been some positive signs lately, and I hope we could continue that. Yes?
In your national hat, can you live without landmines?
Actually, it's probably easy to answer if you wear your SACURE hat.
I would say that we have given our input to the chairman, and the chairman is making his recommendation to the National Command Authority.
What's your view on it, though, as a four-star general?
It is complicated. You have to make sure that when you talk landmines, it's a broad category of what you're talking about, and I think you need to it's much more than just anti-personnel, dumb anti-personnel mines, smart ones, landmines, tank mines, etc. And I think it's a very broad category. I would just say that we have been afforded the opportunity to make our recommendations known to the chairman, and the chairman will make his recommendation to the National Command Authority. Yes?
How is demining going? You've spoken in the past of the importance of demining.
Demining in Bosnia? Of what we know, it's not going as fast as I would like. It's going to take a long time. I think we've made some positive steps with the Mine Awareness Center that we've established in Zagreb. The High Representative has also established a center that we're working closely with. The European Union has allocated, I think it's $750,000 for equipment. And so there is some movement, but it's going to take a long time. We're trying to make sure that the roads are cleared and to try to avoid what occurred the other day, where civilians would, in these large groups, would spill over into minefields. It's a great concern of ours. That's why the close coordination with the High Commissioner for Refugees is important.
Time for two more questions. I promised the general he could have lunch.
Yeah,
He's being kind to me now.
What can you tell us about this incident yesterday where a soldier apparently shot himself? And also more generally, are you concerned at all about morale?
Well, I think morale has been very good so far, and I've been down there several times. I've talked to a lot of the troops from many of the nations. Remember, we have about 30 nations with us now. I think the clarity of mission, and that's why I want to keep this in front of us, of what I've talked about here, how do we make this transition, is important. The individual you talked about is still being investigated, and I hope to have some more information.
Was it suicide or not?
I don't know yet, and we'll try to get some information as it becomes available. And I've been sort of out of the net for the last several hours, but it's being investigated. But let me tell you that the troop morale is extremely high. I've been very, very pleased when I've talked to the troops how much they understand their mission. And this is a difficult, complex mission. And as we try to make this transition I'm talking about, it is very much so to keep the focus on mission. Not mission creep, but mission. And that's what I'm trying to do. And how you work in freedom of movement into that is part of the mission. And that's the point I've been trying to make. And if the soldiers understand that and the leaders understand that, then we're in pretty good shape. My concern has always been, and I've been around soldiers for 35 years, is soldier complacency. And we cannot allow that to set in, and therefore it's very important that we make it very clear what the mission is and what we expect the troops to do. And they're doing a wonderful job.
General, I know you don't like to talk about D+366, but no briefing would be completed if we didn't ask you about what's going to happen afterwards. To what extent can you tell us, have there been any discussions, plannings for any kind of a post-IFOR force?
Well, there's always some discussions going on. But clearly, what I've tried, and I probably haven't done a good job here, is to try to explain that what will determine what happens between 270 and 365 is what we do now. How do we create the best conditions to give us the opportunity after the elections between 270 and 365 to then make some to understand what that mission's going to be. But if we can concentrate on the elections now and making sure that that can take place, I think that will influence what we do later on.
Can you foresee a scenario where there might be some NATO troops in Bosnia next year, not necessarily U.S., but NATO troops?
I'm not going to speculate on that. That will be a political as well as a military question. The mission I have is for 1 year, and that's what I need to focus on.
General, you talked of the importance of refugee return,
Yes.
one of your criteria. Given the hostility with which the first refugee returns have been greeted, do you foresee IFOR having to provide area security in population centers where refugees are going back?
Well, we're working that very hard with the UNHCR, because that's going to be, they are responsible for trying to estimate what's coming back and what's going to happen. The British, by the way, have submitted a very good paper in the Council on refugees and how to approach what it is we're trying to do, and we're working that very closely. But I think that the coordination that takes place between IFOR and UNHCR and the High Representative is going to be very important. We're trying to do that now. Therefore, what roads to use, how are they going to come in, what coordination needs to take place, how do we take advantage of the joint civilian commissions to be able to say, who are you bringing, when are you bringing them, to try to get the coordination between the entities. And let's be clear, it's only been 130 days here, so I think we've got to continue to work to build as much as we can some trust and confidence among ethnic groups that have been fighting one another for several years.
General, you said when you were up here last that aside from rebuilding bridges and roads and that kind of thing, that you all might, if you had the opportunity, help with schools and that kind of thing. What else are you doing to rebuild the country, the military doing that?
That is being looked at, and I will use the phrase is within our capabilities. I have to give flexibility to the commanders on the ground that as they look at that challenge they have of monitoring cantonment areas, for example. What we have to make sure is that the former warring factions not only return to barracks with their troops and with their weapons, but they stay there. And so I'd rather let the commanders on the ground have the flexibility to say what do they need to ensure they can do their military task, and then within that capability to provide whatever assistance they can to the civilian agencies. But I think we have to be very careful there, because I do not want them to lose their focus on their primary military missions. Yes?
Besides whether or not elections are held, what else are you going to look at D+270 and after, in that D+270 to 365 period?
Well, many of the things that I talked about there, that hopefully the key will be the election, but I think what we're also hoping for is that there's the International Police Task Force will be up and running, and I think it's very important that they train the former warring factions police force, so there's some law and order that will be involved in the country, and I think that's going to be very important, and that's why I put it up there. We have, for example, 14 civil affairs reservists, military reservists, working with the International Police Task Force now. There's a training center of training the International Police Task Force and also Federation and other former warring factions police. That needs to take place, and we hope that by 270 that will be well underway. It's those conditions that will underpin what we're going to face at 270 to 365, and it's premature to make those decisions now. What I want to do is keep our head in the game and keep our focus clear here on what it is we need to do now. And I don't want to leap ahead. And it's very important for the troops to understand that. And I'm trying to be clear. Thank you. Thank you all.